Hello everyone, how's it going? So let's get back to what we were doing, picking up from last week where we finished off our live 2D characters. Let's go ahead and get onto our last character type, which is the 3D characters and how you can implement those into your project and into your visual novel if that's the kind of style that you want to go for. 3D models, they're easy enough to implement into the UI as long as you use the right rendering. So we're basically going to be doing the same thing that we did with Live 2D, where we render them in a separate field, a separate render group, and then project that onto our main character panel. That way we don't have any depth issues and we don't have to worry about our 3D characters clipping through the back of our images or our front objects, because that can definitely happen when you use 3D objects. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up our render group so that way we can get our 3D characters in this actual scene. So we've got main and live 2D here. Let's just make another one. Let's create an empty and call this model 3D after the type of our 3D characters. And inside of here we're going to have the main panel where things are going to be spawned. This will be just like how we have for live 2D. We created our canvas and all the live 2D characters were parented to this panel. We're not going to have a canvas directly within the model 3D panel because we're going to run them slightly different than live 2D characters. But what we are going to do is we're going to create an empty, and this will sort of be the panel, or more accurately the object that the live or the model 3D characters get parented to. So let's just go ahead and name this in the same naming convention with characters and model 3D. So as I was working on this, I found a nice way to handle these 3D characters, because with the way that characters work with 3D models is obviously they're going to be using materials, and depending on how you make your materials, or if you import them from like other resources, other models, then you're not necessarily going to have the best time working with transparency. And so fading in 3D characters would be something that could be quite difficult, and even more difficult to make it look good. So what we're going to be doing specifically for these characters is we're going to make each 3D character have its own canvas and its own camera. And that renders to a render texture, which then gets projected onto the main canvas as a normal character object. This does increase the rendering requirements, so if you'd prefer not to do that way, you just want to work with 3D characters, then you can do what I suggested with live 2D characters and just make sure that you have some depth set between your layers and make sure that your characters fall within that depth and they don't come in or out of it, and then just manage your transitions the way that you feel is appropriate. But for what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set them up each with their own renderer and have those renderers project onto the main canvas, so that way they will essentially be just like our normal sprite characters, and they'll even be able to sort with the regular sprite characters. So they're not going to have some special panel in here that has a rendering of all the characters. They're going to render into their own individual character instances. So let's go ahead and take the opportunity to import our first character. So I went and had some AI generate art for a character, and then had that character created by an artist on Fiverr. So what we've got here is sort of an anime style character that has been rigged, has blend shape expressions. If we look right over here, we've got these different blend shapes that we can just add for this character. So what we're going to be working with is both using the model, using animations, and using blend shapes for these characters to get exactly what we want for our characters. And when we import our character into the scene, we're going to have to set up some materials and get some lighting in the scene. So let me go ahead and right click here, go to light, and then add our directional light into the scene. And I've already applied some materials to this character to give it that anime style look. This character and the materials will not be available for download because all of which are paid assets. The materials I bought off the Unity Asset Store, and of course the model I had made for my own purposes through an artist on Fiverr. So you'll have to get your own character for that, but there are many resources online where you can download characters, or if you have the skill, make your own, and let's go ahead and proceed once you got your character imported into Unity, get your materials set up, get your lighting up, then let's go ahead and set up our render group and proceed from there. So of course the way I said this is going to work is each character is going to have their own rendering group. So inside of our model 3D empty here, we've got this as our panel where they're all going to be parented to. So let's go ahead and make the render group prefab for this 3D character. So I'm going to make a new empty and call this render group, followed by a tag, followed by the brackets, just like we would name our characters. And I'm going to name this character. So this is Amaria. So that'll be the render group, and then we'll set up the character prefab later. But let's go ahead and set up what we need in here. And you know what? Literally, as I was recording this, I literally just figured out I don't even need a canvas for this setup because we're projecting it onto the main canvas anyway. We needed a canvas for our live 2D characters because they weren't being controlled directly on the main character canvas. So that's why they have their own. So we only need a camera for our 3D characters. So let's go ahead and add in the camera here. So we'll have that. Where's my character? Doop. There she is. Let's parent the character to the camera. And I just want to position everything so it's a little beside of the live 2D character setup over here. And let's go ahead and change our camera from perspective to orthographic. And we'll move the character panel a little more over as well. Okay, great. So now we have this camera capturing our 3D character. But let's go ahead and set up the layer that our 3D characters will be on. That way no other camera captures them. So just like we did for Live 2D, let's make UI tac model 3D. And all of our models will be on that layer. So let's go ahead and highlight this whole model 3D, or select that object and set it to that layer. Yes, change all the children. And then our camera, let's change the culling mask from everything to only UI model 3D. And we just make sure that our other main camera is not using model 3D, which it's not. Camera for live 2D should be the same. That's only using the live 2D layer. Okay, cool. So this is only picking up the 3D models layer. Now make sure you've given your character a folder, just like we've done for our other characters, placed inside the character's folder, inside of resources. And let's go ahead and add ourselves the next item that we need, and that's going to be what we're going to project this camera on to hit the other canvas. So everything this camera views is going to be rendered onto our character's panel. So we'll create ourselves a render texture here, and we'll simply call that render texture. Let's go ahead and take our camera and make sure that the render texture is set to the output. And once we do that, it's going to automatically resize the camera to whatever the resolution of our render texture is. So if I wanted to change this to 1920 by, say, 500, then we could do that. And if we look at our camera, it does indeed change down here. We can see that that has reflected here. And we're going to want our camera to update this display and screen here so we can scale our character appropriately. So to get that to update with the texture, you can select the output texture and just toggle the render texture again. And now you can see that it has sized up to fit our resolution. So obviously that's too big. So let's change this to something else that might fit our character better. For this particular character, I'm going to go with something that has a decent resolution so that I can capture the quality of the character. So I will make this 2200 by 2700. And we can see we have ourselves a vertical rectangle. So let's once again toggle that. And now we have the rendering space for our character. So now let's go ahead and scale that character up. I'll move her down to position and then just scale her up a little bit. And once I've got her in a good enough position where it looks like she's captured inside of the camera, then I think we're ready to go. Next thing we can do is we can take a look at our camera and see that it's picking up way too much of the background. So let's change our clipping planes from 1000 to something like 15. And if we look at the sides of the character, we can see that she is right directly centered on the camera. As a matter of fact, if we look in the camera view down here, we can see it's clipping her. So let's go ahead and drag her back a little bit as well. And if we look back at the camera, now we're capturing the whole character. We've got space in front and space in back for motion. So that looks good. So now let's create the character prefab that this camera will render this image to on our main canvas. Let's go to our regular characters panel and just duplicate one of these character prefabs here. We'll start with generic and center that on the UI. Make sure we're fully opaque and right click prefab unpack completely, so we're working on a new object. I'm going to rename this from generic to character Amaria. We'll keep the animator and we'll keep the renderers. Layer 0, I'll change body and switch from the image component. I'll remove that since we're using a render texture. A render texture is not a sprite, so we need ourselves a raw image component. And let's just drag the render texture right on there. This is temporary. We're going to set this up automatically in a moment, but this is so we can see what we're doing right now. So there's our character, kind of long and stretched out. So let's go ahead and resize her. Scaling her to something like this looks like it works well, but we've got the background of that camera. So let's head back to our camera in the render group, and instead of using the background of skybox, we're going to set that to solid color and make sure that the alpha value is down to 0. So now we're not capturing the background, and all we have is our character showing up on the panel. This means that if we were to grab our actual object for the character and rotate her a little bit, we can see that our character in the 3D view is showing up on our 2D canvas. Decided to scale her up a little bit more and center her on the screen, and now let's go ahead and drag our anchors, just like we do for our other character prefabs. Reposition them. And now we've got the prefab for our character on the UI. So let's go ahead and drag this into our character folder and make that a prefab. So now that portion is set up for us. And actually, so is our render group, so let's go ahead and drag the renderer for this character down into the folder. Okay, so we have our 3D object render group with the camera and the object, and we have our character prefab with just the image that will render on screen. And the great thing about that is, with this being on an image, we can just take our character and fade out the canvas group, and we can just fade out that character nice and easy without having to have any special transitions on the materials. And we can do the same thing for setting colors. If we come into the color of just the raw image component, we can change the color of the whole character without affecting their materials. And this will be great for a lot of other things. But one thing that this may not work for is if you're going to have a lot of 3D characters on the screen. Taking a lot of 3D characters, and by a lot I mean like if you're going above like 20 or something, and projecting them all to render textures, especially high quality render textures like this, which capture, if we zoom in, it gets quite a good bit of detail on the character. Not perfect, but great. And you're probably not going to be zooming in that far anyway on the character. If you do, you'll want to use some special images. But you don't want to use too many of these, because then it'll require too much graphics memory and you'll slow down the system unnecessarily. So if you plan on having a large number of 3D characters, then don't go with this setup. Simply make a space for your characters, just like we did for the live 2D, and render them all through one single render texture, and then just control their depth on that particular canvas and do something with their materials. That way you can fade them in, set their color, and do all kinds of stuff. But if you're going with a small number, don't plan to have too many on the screen. If you're working with less than maybe like 15 or so at a time on the screen at any one point, then this should be perfect for you. So let's check another thing. Our character should have animations with them. You can either import animations from Mixamo.com or some other resource. Maybe you've recorded your own, or you make them in Blender. If you make them in Blender and you've imported them with this object or whatever sort of program you used, they will be in the animation tab for this character. And we can see that there are 3 animations here. One called Default, which just has the default pose for this character. We won't really need that. But then we have Idle and Wave as well. So these 2 are going to be animations that I'll link on the character. So let's make sure we have an animations folder for this character. Go inside of there, create, and let's make a new animation controller. And I'll call this Amaria so that way I know who it's for. And let's select our character object and then just add the animator controller to that character. And now we can add animations here. So if we open that up and then look back at our character, if we expand this arrow, we can see the animations are listed here among all the objects that were imported with that FBX. So we can drag in rig idle and rig wave, and they should play on the scene. I'm going to go ahead and temporarily disable our testing object, and I'm also going to make sure that in this character on animation, these idle, at least, should be looping. So I'll select loop time, apply, just so that way it doesn't play once and it's done. So now let's play, and our character should actually go ahead and animate. Which, there we go, she does. So she is animating, just a little bit of slight breathing, and her tail is moving in the background there. And if I'm to make her wave, let's set this as the layer default state. There we go, she waves. And one thing that you'll want to make sure of is when we look back at our character, make sure that your character at any time, when you trigger an animation, let me get the camera view here. When you trigger an animation, you want to make sure that your character stays within the bounds of that camera. If not, then you'll want to tweak the size of your render texture, or rescale your character here in the scene. But here it looks good, so that should be fine. Now let's go ahead and look at the blend shapes on this character. If we go to the character object, the face object here is what has the blend shapes applied. So we can see that listed under blend shapes on this skinned mesh renderer component, and there are all the blend shapes that I have. But you'll notice if I try to move any of them, and maybe you'll have the same issue, they don't actually move. So I can't get any blend shapes running. And that's because if we take a look at our animation, inside of the animation tab, we can see that it has actually recorded the blend shapes in with the animation. So they are constantly going to stay at 0, and I can't edit them at all. So to remedy that, we can actually go ahead and right-click these two animations and Control D to duplicate them, and now we have them as separate animations. So these are now editable, and they are not read-only as the animations attached to this FBX would be. So let's drag those into the animations folder, look in there, and then edit this rig idle. I'm going to grab all of these skinned mesh renderer for the blend shape keyframes and just delete them. So those are gone, and then I'm also going to do the same thing for rig wave. I'm going to grab all these blend shape keys and just delete those. And now they're out. And so the next thing is, let's go ahead and open up the animator. Just delete rig wave and rig idle and make sure I import these new ones. And let's hop back in the scene, and I should be able to change the blend shapes now. So here we go, let's go to face, and then let's do scared. Yep, there we go. So now the blend shapes are working. They're no longer being controlled by the animation, so now we are free to control these through script or other animations. One thing I do want to change is, if we look at our game view, you can see our character is just facing straight forward, when all of our other characters have some sort of direction to them. We could just go ahead and change the rotation of this object, but I don't want to do that. Instead, let's go ahead and prefab, unpack completely, and add a parent to the actual model. So create empty parent, and this one is going to be the model container. And this will have the default orientation. So our character, by default, will need to have her set to a 180 rotation. That leaves her facing the screen directly. So I'm going to take the model container and just rotate that slightly. So 25. But we can see she moves there, so it's obviously got an offset there. Yep, which we can see there. So let me just make sure that model container is lined up perfectly with the character object. And then reparent the model. Whoops. And now just add maybe 25 to that. Okay, so now she's facing left by default. And that'll make it easy to just add a negative and flip from side to side when we want to flip our character. So with that, let's go ahead and delete the old prefab and recreate the render group prefab. You can probably override it, but sometimes when I override prefabs, it messes up. So sometimes I just like to delete them and recreate them. But that's great. This is the starting point for getting 3D characters onto our screen. So I'm going to end this episode here, and in the next episode, we're going to spawn our character into the scene and automate the process to create our render texture for us. That way, if we create multiples of the same character, we are not confined to the same render texture. So I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.